Welcome to the second half of chapter 54. So we left off here and we're going to talk about resource partitioning. Basically how this works, if you're sympatric, that just means you're living in the same area, same time. So if two species are sympatric, what's going to generally happen is if their niches tend to overlap, so essentially if they're after kind of some similar things or the same types of things, they don't really want to compete. We've talked about this competitive exclusion ideas. So oftentimes what happens is one of them kind of just says, all right, I'll take this section, you take that section, and that way they minimize the actual overlap where there might be any competition. So for example, you'll get warblers, and there'll be many species of warblers living in a spruce tree. But some of them will take the top, and so they'll eat the insects that are living up there. Some will start to take kind of the next section, and they'll tend to eat the insects that are there. And as you get further down, you'll see some of them like to stay towards the middle of the tree, so kind of further up on the branches, if you will, towards the trunk. And then some of them will go towards the edges of the lower parts. So you can have 3, 4, 5 different species of warblers all on that same spruce tree, but they just kind of stake out their own area and just make sure they stay in that area so they can still somewhat get along. And so this is what's called resource partitioning. You'll see the anole lizards, these guys here, they also do the same thing, except in this case they eat insects and they bask. So they'll tend to kind of go to certain levels of the tree. So some are at the very tree tops, some are lower, some tend to just hang around in like bushes, some of them like fence posts. So they will just kind of adapt where they each get their own kind of area within the environment that they stake out as theirs to prevent them from having to conflict with others. Now, character displacement, this one's kind of cool where you can have multiple species like with finches in the Galapagos. And so you might have where their average beak size is going to end up being somewhere around, and this is really crappily drawn, but deal with it, we'll say somewhere around 3, all right? We can say 3 centimeters. Doesn't really matter, we're just doing a general thing here. And so we can have two species that pretty much share the same general beak size. But if I put those two species together and I make them live sympatrically, what oftentimes happens is they'll shift a little bit. So you'll get one species might kind of move and you'll see its beak actually tends to get smaller, so more around 2. And then you'll get the other species will tend to shift as well, and so you might tend to get where its beak gets a little bit longer, so it comes in somewhere more around 4. And so over time, as they kind of get used to each other, they just tend to shift away towards the extremes, and so this way, once again, it allows them to conflict less. Because by changing those characters, they can change things like the food sources that they're eating, and then that means that they won't come in contact with each other as much. And so character displacement isn't just me saying I'll live somewhere differently. This is literally natural selection acting on the organisms to make the organisms start to look more and more dissimilar so that they can avoid conflicting. So 2 different species, essentially species 1, species 2 when they live together, and then this would be species 1 or 2. They'd look about the same if they were living separately, away from each other. They wouldn't have to change their beak size. They do so only in response to the other. Now, an ecological niche is going to be your job, your role in the environment. It's what you eat, what you need to mate, who you mate with, it's where you live, it's what eats you, it's kind of everything about your role in the environment. So that's this whole biotic, so that's all the living stuff you interact with, and abiotic resource usage. Now, the funny thing about niches is you can oftentimes live in a variety of conditions, but we don't actually find you in those conditions that are kind of your theoretical possibilities. And so we call that theoretical possibility your fundamental niche. So this is all the places that you could live. So in this case, you can see that if we kind of draw this out, you've got this circle that would kind of represent, wow, that's really badly done by me, everywhere that it could live for species A. And then you could have another species that has its own kind of niche, and that's everywhere that it could live. So all of its stuff. And what happens in reality is that when they intermingle, we've talked about this idea of resource partitioning, we've talked about this idea of competitive exclusion, we've talked about this idea of character displacement, and so we tend to get where for some of these areas, somebody else is there, whether it's a predator, a competitor, something that prevents you from actually living in that area. And so this area of conflict, you might find that the organism doesn't actually end up living. So the organism in reality ends up just being in part of its fundamental niche. And we call that part that it's actually living in the realized niche. This is the stuff that you've actually managed to take advantage of. Wherever the overlap occurs, you tend to get competitive exclusion, and so that means at least one of them typically gets edged out of it. Now, the other guy might be fine. This species, if we're saying species Z here and species A, you'll see that species Z might actually be occupying that portion of the fundamental niche. That's actually part of its realized niche, is that it precludes A, it bumps A out. But that also doesn't mean that there's not somebody else that's kind of taking up part of Z's niche somewhere else and bumping it out of it. So it's exceedingly rare in nature that you'd find something that's managing to take advantage of its entire fundamental niche. Usually somebody overlaps somewhere, and because of that competition, you either give it up or they exterminate you from the area, and so we don't find you everywhere that you could theoretically be. Now, ecological succession is when we have disturbances. So we tend to talk about these climax communities. That means these stable, long-lived communities. That's what we're looking at here. So we've got a nice forest that's got big trees, bushes, some grasses. It can handle some minor disturbances and still be fine. If you chop down one tree, don't just go, oh my gosh, the forest's gone. But if something major happens, like a forest fire, could be a natural disaster, could be a new insect or something coming in that's killing off a bunch of the trees, if something really jacks this place up, you can then start succession, where we wipe out most of the plant life, and then we have to kind of build it back. Now, there's two different ways this can happen, though. What this one is showing is what would be secondary. And so it's secondary because you'll notice the soil is still there. So we've destroyed the vegetation, kind of like if I bulldoze the forest and then I plow the dirt, so all I'm left with is just churned up soil. There's no living plant life at that point. That's secondary succession because I do still have the dirt, I do still have the soil present, which makes it easier for you to get your pioneer species, the early species that move in. So these will typically be like herbs and grasses. If you're talking about primary succession, you'll see we'll talk about lichen and mosses. And so these early guys will creep in, and then they ultimately kind of start opening up a window, and you start to get bigger guys move in, like fast-growing trees, shrubs, bushes, and then eventually you start to get your longer-lived trees that take more time to grow start to come in there, until eventually when you're done with this whole process, you tend to have, if it's a forest, these long-lived trees that are present now, that are there, stable, situations gone back to a climax community. With primary succession, this is more like a volcanic island, where you basically start out with just rock. And so you have to get these pioneer species like lichen and moss that don't really need soil. They move in there, they die, they start to build up soil, and then as the soil builds up, you can get bigger and bigger things as there's more and more soil to support it, until eventually you get to the same climax community. But it can take a lot longer, because depending on where you're at, getting that soil in the first place can take tens, hundreds, thousands, in some cases potentially millions of years, if it's a pretty inhospitable place, to try to get enough soil so it can sustain the additional organisms that would live there. These bigger trees and such need quite a bit of soil, obviously, in general, to make it work and develop like a full forest community. All right, energy. So just to be clear, within any ecosystem, you're going to have losses of energy, massive losses between each layer of the food chain, food web, food pyramid, whatever you want to call it. So at the bottom here, where we have our producers, they're going to capture a lot of energy. We're going to have a lot of them. So these guys, tremendous amount of energy. So we'll say 100% is what we're at energy-wise. Now, when they get eaten, much of the energy that's in those producers does not get transferred. It's not digestible. So when the consumers, the herbivores, eat that, much of it ends up just getting kind of crapped out. And then of the energy that they do manage to get, only some of that gets converted to ATP so it can be used. You have losses because of heat. There's going to be plenty of ways that energy seeps out of the organism, if you will, via heat radiation, etc., and so it's lost to that organism. So on average, the rule is that about 10% of the energy makes it to the next step. So 10% of it gets caught and stored by the actual herbivores. And then those guys get eaten by our primary consumers, and they get about 10% of the energy from the herbivores. Same basic pattern holds true. And so you now have where they have about 1% of that original energy. So then when you go up another level where the secondary consumer eats a primary consumer, you're now talking about 0.1%. And so you can see that we rapidly hemorrhage energy into the surrounding environment. And so because of this, you really can't get a really large food web or food chain, because as you keep going up levels, there's so little energy that's eventually trickling its way to the top. So you can get to probably around 5 to 6 levels, and at that point there's just not enough energy to make this work. So the organisms at the top will just die. Detritivores can help, go ahead and break that down. And then ultimately they'll release nutrients for the producers, and so you get kind of like the circle of nutrients at least. But energy-wise, you will not get something that's like 80 levels deep. There's just not enough energy because so much of it's lost at each step of the way. Okay, community structures. There's 2 ways we can kind of think about who I'm going to have in a community. The first one's bottom up, so this means I want to look at what producers, I want to look at what species that are plentiful, that are at the bottom of the food pyramid. These producers, because they're providing food for the organisms that are there. So if I know who's there, if I know what the food available is, I can kind of figure out what other guys might live there, because I know who might eat that type of food, that's the producer. I know ultimately who might eat that guy, the herbivore that's eating the producer, and so I can try to build things based upon the first guys, based upon the bottom of that food pyramid we talked about. So I'm starting here and working my way up. So the food essentially determines who's there to eat it. The other way you can think about this is top down, where you say, all right, if I look at these top predators, I can know what they eat, so I can use them to kind of predict what prey species would be there, which prey species, not just that they eat, but they can also survive them being present. Because some organisms might just get killed off completely and go extinct in that area because the predator is too efficient at getting them. But there's other prey species that they can catch, but they're not good enough at catching them, or they don't eat enough of them to ultimately wipe them out. And so that allows me to kind of guess who's likely going to be below this, and then from there, based upon those guys, I can do the same thing and say, well, who would likely be there if I find this guy, and then who would likely be there if I find this guy. And so I literally try and make my predictions, assumptions, working from the top down. So there's nothing really incredibly inspired about this. It's just you kind of look at the producers and then kind of assume who's likely going to be there because of that, or do you look at the top predator and then work in the opposite direction? It is 2 ways, though, of trying to figure out who's likely to be in a community without knowing a tremendous amount. And then as we wrap up here, we've got the species area curve. This one's critical because it makes it apparent why it's so important sometimes that we have these big uninterrupted areas where we allow organisms to live and we prevent them from being messed with. So this is why when they talk about doing nature preserves, the size of the preserve is a big deal. This is why when we talk about islands and we talk about biodiversity, the size of the island is a big deal. Because the bigger the island, you'll see rapidly the amount of species richness jumps. So a very small island cannot sustain many different species. It might have 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever species on one of these small islands. As you get to a bigger island, you'll see it does start to rapidly go up. And so like a bigger island, say this is 5, this bigger island might be able to handle 10. And then it keeps going up, and so eventually like this biggest island here, maybe this can handle like 18 different species because it's larger. Now at some point you do get diminishing returns. So at some point as you get bigger and bigger spaces, you stop getting a huge amount of increase in species richness. But especially at the bottom here, there's a huge difference from having like 1 square mile or half a square mile versus say 10 square miles. There's a huge difference in the amount that you can sustain. Now once you start to get to like 100 square miles, it won't matter that much beyond there. You're not going to see as big of a return. But this is why it's critical if you're like setting up a preserve, or if you're looking at islands trying to preserve biodiversity, these bigger islands is where it'd be crucial, because if you've got a pretty large island, say 40 square, well in this case it's in meters, but let's say 40 square miles in terms of an island versus 1 square mile, that 40 square mile island is going to be able to handle so many more species, and it likely has so many more species, that preserving the species on that island is way more valuable than trying to just save that little island, which is probably easier to save, but you don't get as much for it because there's just not as much that it can support. So this is why in nature now we focus on bigger islands in many cases. When we're doing preserves, we try to make sure that there's large chunks of land for each preserves. And this is also why when they're doing planning, they try and prevent too much fragmentation. So if we're going to have things like fences and roads, they're trying to find ways to connect different chunks of land, because if they can connect them with like underpasses, or if they can put up fencing to prevent the animals from getting harmed, to let them go from like one area to another area, say through some farmland, by connecting those chunks, they now make a bigger chunk, and that bigger chunk allows for more species diversity. More stuff is able to live there if we can expand it. So you'll see them talk about things like habitat corridors, which are designed to just connect chunks that otherwise would have been fragmented and separated. So it could be something as simple as making an underpass where animals can go under the freeway to get from one side to the other. So now you've got these two areas that are forested, that are somewhat wild, that were on either side of the road that previously were separate. So you had small chunks of land, but now by connecting them, we now have one much larger connected chunk of land, so lots of animals that could live there that otherwise could not if it wasn't that big.